Before the clash of armies, before the first battle horn echoed across the hills, his very name sent ripples of dread through kingdoms. He was a commander whose victories were carved not only in stone but in the minds of those who dared to stand against Rome. Enemies feared his cunning, his brutality, his absolute will to crush rebellion without mercy. Yet the strangest fear was not on foreign soil, it was among his own men. For those who served him knew that loyalty could be rewarded with glory, or punished with the same cold efficiency as treason. Friend or foe, no one was safe from his judgment. This is the ruthless story of power, fear. In the dying light of a Roman sunset, the commander stood silent, his eyes scanning the horizon. Behind him, the disciplined lines of the legion stretched like an iron wall, shields polished, spears ready, banners swaying in the wind. Before him lay the lands of a people who did not yet know they were already conquered. His name was whispered in taverns, marketplaces, and enemy war councils alike, not with admiration, but with the unease one feels when speaking of storms or plagues. This was Gaius Marcellus Corvus, a man born into neither wealth nor noble title, but into an age where war could make a man a god or a monster. Corvus's youth was shaped in the back streets of Rome, where survival was a lesson learned daily. The city in those years was a cauldron patricians feasted in marble halls, while the commoners fought over scraps in alleys. It was here he first learned that fear was the strongest currency. As a boy, he saw gang leaders command obedience not with wealth or speeches, but with the certainty that disobedience meant ruin. Years later, on the battlefield, he would refine that same principle into an art. When Rome called for soldiers, Corvus volunteered. Not out of patriotism, but hunger for escape, for recognition, for power. The legions were his school, and war was his tutor. In Gaul, he learned endurance, marching days without food through rain-soaked mud. In Hispania, he learned cunning, outmaneuvering tribal ambushes in treacherous mountain passes. But it was in Germania that he learned terror, not the fear of death, but how to use death to hollow out the will of an enemy before a single sword strike. His first command came not by seniority, but by chance. A centurion fell in battle, and Corvus, already known for his ruthless discipline, took control. What followed was a victory so absolute that even hardened veterans looked at him differently. His strategy was simple and merciless. Strike where the enemy feels safe, burn what they love, and leave survivors to spread the story. Corvus understood something. Few commanders grasped fear was a weapon sharper than any Gladius. The Senate noticed. Promotions followed, each one marked by campaigns drenched in both glory and controversy. In Illyria, villages surrendered at the mere sight of his standards. In Thrace, enemy scouts fled rather than report what they had seen. Yet with each victory came whispers that Corvus punished hesitation in his own ranks with the same swiftness he punished treachery in the enemy. The tale of a centurion executed for retreating a single step spread like wildfire. His soldiers obeyed not just out of loyalty, but because they knew failure carried a price paid in blood. To Corvus, Rome's enemies were not merely armies, they were disease, and he was the cure. He refused to negotiate with rebels, considering diplomacy nothing more than a pause before the inevitable. Where other commanders might parade mercy for political favor, Corvus made examples. In one campaign against a northern tribe, he ordered the captured chieftain bound and displayed at the front of the march, forcing the defeated warriors to watch their leader dragged toward Rome in chains. By the time they reached the capital, the prisoners no longer shouted insults. They stared at the ground, silent, broken. Yet the man behind the iron mask of command was not without calculation. Corvus did not kill recklessly. Every punishment, every act of brutality was meant to be seen, to echo, to ripple outward like a stone in still water. He understood the mechanics of dread the way a single unforgettable act could save him from fighting 10 more battles. The less his men and enemies alike tested his resolve, the fewer swords he needed to draw. But fear is a double-edged blade. It cuts the enemy quickly, but it cuts the wielder slowly, almost imperceptibly. Among his own officers, admiration was laced with unease. They saw him as an unstoppable force, but also as a man for whom friendship was a liability and compassion a weakness. At night in the camps, when the fires burned low, some wondered if their commander's loyalty to Rome was matched by Rome's loyalty to him. One story, told in hushed tones, marked the turning point of his reputation. During a winter campaign in Dacia, food supplies ran dangerously low. The men were exhausted, frostbitten, and desperate. A group of soldiers abandoned their posts to hunt for themselves. When they returned with meat, Corvus summoned the entire cohort. He praised the hunters for their skill, then ordered them executed for abandoning the line. "Discipline is not for the full belly," he declared. "It is for the empty one." The message was clear. In Corvus's army, survival depended not on luck or resourcefulness, but on obedience without question. The effect was immediate. Morale did not crumble, it hardened, like steel under hammer and flame. The soldiers fought not just against Rome's enemies, but against the possibility of becoming Corvus's next example. His methods turned the legion into a precision instrument, one that could march further, fight longer, and strike harder than any enemy could match. By the time he was granted full command of the 10th Legion, Corvus had become more than a man. To Rome's enemies, he was a phantom whose arrival meant inevitable defeat. To his own troops, he was both shield and sword, protector and executioner. And to himself, he was the embodiment of Rome's will, the steel in the spine of an empire that could not afford to bend. But power and fear, once unleashed, are difficult to control. As his campaigns grew more ambitious and his victories more complete, so too did the unease in the Senate. A commander who terrifies Rome's enemies is an asset. A commander who terrifies Rome itself is a problem. And in the corridors of power, problems do not survive for long. The year was 74 BC. The 10th Legion had just returned from the frozen frontiers of Dacia, their armor dented, their cloaks ragged, but their banners unbroken. In the streets of Rome, crowds gathered to see the man who had broken 3 enemy coalitions in a single year. Women threw flowers, merchants shouted blessings, and senators put on their most convincing smiles. But behind closed doors, the Senate's whispers were growing sharper. Corvus was no longer simply a servant of Rome. He had become a figure large enough to cast his own shadow over the Republic itself. His victories had given him not only power, but the loyalty of thousands of battle-hardened veterans. To some senators, that loyalty looked dangerously close to devotion. And devotion in politics is a dangerous commodity when it's aimed at a man instead of the state. For now, Corvus pretended not to notice. He accepted the Senate's honors, attended their banquets, and stood in their marble halls, offering formal thanks with the same iron expression he wore on campaign. But the battlefield had sharpened his instincts. He could smell the unease as clearly as the scent of rain before a storm. His next orders took him east, into the lands of the Pontic king, Mithridates VI, a ruler as cunning as any Roman senator and twice as dangerous. This was not a campaign of quick victories. The Pontic armies were disciplined, their cavalry swift, their archers deadly. Here Corvus's talent for psychological warfare would be tested in a theater far from the stone walls of Rome. His first move was not to attack, but to appear. In a show of pure intimidation, Corvus marched the 10th Legion along the ridges overlooking Pontic towns, drums echoing, war banners snapping in the wind. He ordered his men to make camp just close enough for the townsfolk to see the disciplined movements, the rows of gleaming shields, and the strange war beasts, massive molosser hounds, armored and chained, that prowled at the edge of the camp. Without a single arrow fired, the town's gates closed tight, and its markets went silent. But this time, the enemy was not so easily cowed. Mithridates was no tribal chieftain. He was a king who understood the cost of fear and the value of defiance. While Corvus projected strength, Mithridates spread rumors that the 10th Legion was starving, that Rome was preparing to abandon them, that Corvus himself was planning to betray his men for a senator's gold. In war, a sword can kill a man, but a rumor can kill an army. Corvus responded with precision. He singled out the sources of these whispers, captured spies, suspected deserters, and executed them publicly at dawn. It silenced some voices, but it also hardened others. Men who once feared him now began to wonder if their commander trusted anyone at all. The tension within his ranks grew sharper when supplies ran thin. The Pontic king had sent raiding parties to burn crops and poison wells. Corvus ordered night marches through hostile terrain to seize what little grain remained. Every soldier was expected to fight not just in battle, but in the dark hours between battles, to guard supply lines, to patrol perimeters, to track and kill enemy scouts. Sleep became a rare luxury. One night, during a bitter windstorm, a cohort failed to return from its patrol. At dawn, their bodies were found scattered along a ravine, their throats cut. The survivors swore they had been ambushed by Pontic cavalry. Corvus didn't believe them. He gathered the survivors in front of the legion and accused them of abandoning their post to save their own lives. Without trial, he ordered their execution. It was then that a quiet, dangerous shift began among his men. They still obeyed him, but their eyes no longer lit with pride when he entered the camp. Now they watched him with the wary respect one gives to a blade useful in battle, deadly when mishandled. But Corvus didn't need their love. He needed their obedience. And obedience was what he got when the Battle of Zela finally came. The Pontic army, confident after months of grinding the Romans down, met Corvus on a narrow plain flanked by rocky slopes. It should have been an even fight. It was not. Corvus used the terrain like a weapon. Under cover of night, he had stationed hidden detachments along the slopes, each armed with javelins and slings. As the Pontic cavalry charged, they found themselves funneled into a killing ground where the 10th Legion's infantry closed in like an iron trap. The enemy broke, and the slaughter began. When it was over, Corvus stood among the bodies, his armor streaked with blood, his expression unreadable. His soldiers cheered not for joy, but from the raw relief of survival. They had seen their commander pull victory from the jaws of defeat, but they had also seen the cost. Hundreds of enemy prisoners were taken that day. None saw the next sunrise. The message to Mithridates was clear. Rome's mercy was gone. But the message to the 10th Legion was different. We will win, but we will win on my terms. The victory at Zela cemented Corvus's reputation as a master of both strategy and psychological warfare. Yet, it also deepened the cracks within his own ranks. In the weeks that followed, 2 of his senior centurions requested reassignment. Officially, it was due to family obligations. Unofficially, it was because they feared that serving too close to Corvus for too long was as dangerous as facing the enemy. When word of these resignations reached Rome, the Senate took note. Corvus was still their most effective commander, but now he was a commander whose methods were eroding the very legions he led. And for the Senate, a damaged legion was nearly as dangerous as a defeated one. The seeds had been planted. In the halls of power, far from the front lines, plans were already forming, plans that might end Corvus's campaigns not with an enemy's sword, but with the stroke of a pen. By the time the 10th Legion returned to Rome, Corvus was no longer merely a soldier in the eyes of the people. He was a symbol. For the commoner, he was the shield of Rome, the man who crushed kings and rebels alike. For the Senate, he was a question that demanded an answer. How much power can one man hold before he becomes a threat to the Republic itself? The city welcomed him with parades. Laurel wreaths were placed on his head, gold was poured at his feet, and poets recited verses, comparing him to the heroes of old. Corvus accepted it all with the stoic face of a man who knew that applause could turn to condemnation in a heartbeat. The cheers of the people were loud, but in the marbled corridors of the Senate, the conversations were quieter and far more dangerous. Whispers spread of his executions in the field, of the fear that kept his legion in line, of the centurions who had resigned rather than serve under him any longer. Some senators admired his efficiency, others saw it as cruelty that could one day be turned against Rome itself. The Republic had ended dictators before, they would not hesitate to end another. But Corvus was not blind. He knew politics was a second battlefield one where daggers were hidden in words instead of sheaths. He began making gestures to soften his image, attending public games, donating grain to the poor, praising the Senate in speeches. These efforts earned him a handful of allies among the patricians, but his reputation among the legions remained the same, that of a commander who demanded everything and gave nothing but victory in return. Then came the rebellion in the southern provinces. It was not a tribal uprising or a foreign invasion, but a mutiny Roman soldiers, disillusioned and unpaid, declaring their defiance of the Senate's authority. The Senate, with few generals willing to face their own countrymen in battle, turned once more to Corvus. It was a poisoned chalice. When he arrived in the rebellious province, Corvus found the enemy was not an untrained mob, but disciplined deserters, veterans of past wars who knew Roman tactics as well as he did. Among them were men who had once served under him, men who had felt the sting of his punishments and carried the memory like a scar. The first engagement was a stalemate. Corvus's disciplined lines clashed with the rebels' organized resistance, and neither side broke. That night, his scouts reported something unusual. The rebel campfires burned bright and open, as if inviting him to attack. It was bait, and he knew it. Still, Corvus could not resist the chance to end the rebellion swiftly. At dawn, he ordered an assault. The legion stormed the rebel camp and found it nearly empty. From the surrounding hills, horns blared. Arrows rained down. The rebels had used their knowledge of his aggression against him, drawing him into a killing ground, much like the one he had once used at Zela. The 10th Legion fought with desperate courage, but Corvus had been outmaneuvered. It was the first time in years that his soldiers saw him bleed, the first time they saw doubt flicker in his eyes. They managed to withdraw, but the damage was done not just to their numbers, but to the myth of their commander's invincibility. In the days that followed, rumors spread through the camp. Some claimed the Senate had set him up to fail, sending him against the rebels with inadequate supplies. Others whispered that the gods had abandoned him, that his cruelty had finally drawn their wrath. Worst of all were the murmurs that perhaps the rebels were right, that Rome, and the men like Corvus who served it, cared nothing for the lives they spent so freely. The final blow came not from the rebels, but from within his own ranks. One night, as Corvus walked the perimeter of the camp, he found a dagger buried in the ground at the entrance to his tent, a silent message in steel. The next morning, a unit scheduled for patrol simply vanished, their armor left neatly in their tents. They had joined the rebels. Corvus responded the only way he knew how, with fear. He assembled the entire legion, denounced the deserters as traitors, and executed 10 men chosen by lot from their cohort, a brutal revival of the ancient punishment of decimation. It sent a shiver through the ranks, but it also shattered the last remnants of their loyalty. Now, they obeyed only because they feared him more than the enemy. When the final battle with the rebels came, the 10th fought with grim determination, but without the unity they had once shown. The rebels were defeated, but at a cost so high it erased the meaning of victory. Corvus returned to Rome not as a hero, but as a commander whose legion had been hollowed out by his own hand. The Senate wasted no time. They praised his service to the Republic in public, but in private they stripped him of command, citing the need for fresh leadership. His victories were remembered, but so were his methods. The man who had terrified nations and crushed kings was now a general without an army. In his final years, Corvus lived quietly on an estate far from the capital. The Senate never moved against him directly, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of fear that even stripped of his rank, he still held the loyalty of some. But the crowds no longer cheered his name. The legions marched under new banners. He was not forgotten entirely. In the border provinces, old soldiers still told stories of the man who had led them to impossible victories. In the lands he had conquered, his name still carried the weight of a curse. And in Rome, senators still spoke his name in hushed tones when debating the balance between power and control. Corvus himself left behind no memoirs, no speeches, no letters. Only a single phrase carved into the stone of his family tomb. Fear is the sharpest sword, but it cuts the hand that wields it. This was the man who ruled battlefields with iron discipline, who commanded legions like a sculptor shaping stone, and who learned too late that even the strongest hand can be broken from within